and he's going to give us an overview of immigration and a little bit of what LSSSW does.
Yes. Awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Braden Lopez-Biggs, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for Lutheran Social Services. What I could say is that when you go down in November and you don't have your passport, that's a really great way to figure out what it's like to be an immigrant or a refugee. So maybe don't bring it, but I don't recommend that. A little too realistic, right? But hey, you'll have been through the simulation. So just a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Braden Lopez-Biggs. I've been with the agency as of November 1st. It will be a year, so getting ready to come up on that, as crazy as that sounds. My husband, Anthony, and I are on the far left, and our 3 fur babies are there. We live in North Phoenix, so it was a wonderful drive to get to come up here to Prescott Valley. I actually, in former work, have worked in and around the city, so I know it pretty well. So very happy to always come up here, and you all have much, much cooler weather. Yes?
What are the fur babies' names?
Poe, Hamilton, Parallax. Anthony.
Who doesn't count as a fur baby? Or a parent?
Yes. Today I'm going to run through all of this pretty quickly. And again, for those of you who will hopefully join us next week, this will give you a little bit of a precursor into the work that we do. Of course, this is very complicated work and is constantly changing, and demographics are shifting, and we have to adapt all the time. So we adapt to real world situations. So what's going on in Israel right now, we will play by ear and figure it out. And we're still dealing with Afghan parolees from a couple years ago, and of course refugees from all over the world. So things are constantly a shift. To start out, a little bit about who we are and our mission. So Lutheran Social Services of the Southwest, we began in 1970, and we've been resettling refugees since 1978. We actually first started working with asylum seekers in 2018. Our work with asylum seekers is a little bit different because we don't necessarily provide the direct service. But we partner with other organizations like Welcome to America, the mission down at the southern border, and other organizations who are on the forefront. It's a lot easier to focus on what we do well than spread ourselves thin, right? We do 1 or 2 things great, or a million things okay. So we're partners in the work overall with the various congregations and missions out there. So currently, LSS serves refugees, asylum seekers, and parolees, both in Phoenix and Tucson. Altogether, Lutheran Social Services operates in 4 counties, so Pima, Santa Cruz, Cochise, and Maricopa. I try to forget about that. So we do stabilize people during crisis, build a foundation where people can thrive, and preserve dignity and respect for the most vulnerable. So that is actually our mission statement, and in there you kind of find our shared values of stabilize, build, and preserve. So ultimately, who are refugees? Well, the legal definition of a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her own country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And most likely they cannot return home or are afraid to do so, as war, ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are all leading causes of refugees fleeing their home countries. So this is the legal definition by the UNHCR, or the United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees, who work with all of the nations who accept refugees and asylees to welcome them into their country. So they have to meet this very legal definition in order to have that legal status and obtain the benefits that come with that. So one of the things that I was asked was to really help define the differences in what we see, because it is often misunderstood or misportrayed by the media or elected officials on how this issue gets addressed. And of course, regardless of where you live, your demographics, these do affect you, and elected officials from the local level all the way up to the federal level have some role to play in dealing with this across the nation. So we have a pretty easy cheat sheet here, so we'll run through each one of these. So an immigrant is a person who comes into a country to take up residence. This person chooses to go to another country. A refugee, as we went through that definition, is a person who's forced to flee their country for fear of persecution. And an asylee is a person who has left their country and is seeking protections from persecution and serious human rights violations, but has yet to be legally recognized as a refugee. So the main difference here is choice. So really where this comes into play, and we'll kind of talk about this as well, is we know ahead of time that a refugee is coming from whatever nation they're from into the United States. We don't always know that an asylee is coming from whatever country they're coming to into the United States or whatever nation they're going to. And the reason for that is because for a refugee, all of the work that goes into that, so the background checks and everything that we'll talk about, happens while they're in their home country. An asylee arrives at the border, but for the United States, the southern border, or the northern border for Canada, and says, I want to declare asylum and come into the United States. That's when this whole process starts. So they go into a holding pattern. From there, they can go potentially, if they have a sponsor, to another state or area, and that sponsor is responsible for them while they go through this process. So you'll hear in the media quite a bit that, we're shipping asylees to New York or somewhere like that. There's a reason. They have a sponsor there.
The interesting is I had somebody say to me in a previous church that they couldn't understand why what they saw as refugee, they saw immigrant, and they couldn't understand why they didn't have the money to come over and go through the process of being part in the United States as an immigrant.
Yep.
And that's how they were treating people. Couldn't quite understand the refugee and the asylee connection.
And
they just assumed that everybody should be like the immigrants.
Yes, and refugees, there is a loan that they get to travel that covers the cost of the travel from, let's say Syria to the United States, that they then have to pay back within a certain amount of time, and they start paying it back once they're in the country for 6 months. So there's a whole process that we have to get into to get to that point, and then they start paying it back. So again, you're absolutely right. An immigrant, if I chose to move to Italy and retire, I'm immigrating to Italy as a choice. It's my responsibility to pay for that all up front. So, yeah. So, refugees are fleeing from, again, race, religion, violence, politics, members of another regime, human trafficking, and many more reasons. It's also incredibly important to note that regardless if it's immigration, asylees, or refugees, Lutheran Social Services is only working and will only work with those who are doing so legally through the process. Some interesting numbers is that there are about 117.2 million people across the world who qualify for, or who are classified in one of those statuses, either as an asylee or a refugee. And I believe the statistic is about every 2 seconds someone else qualifies for that as well. So a quick description of refugees. Some are educated. They might even have college degrees. They might also have no education. Some have worked in professional jobs where they've been, a bank manager, a nurse, a doctor, a professor, and some have never even had a job. There are some who speak English. There are others who speak multiple languages or just their native language. Most refugees do want to work and are in fact hardworking, and many of them even want to learn English or already have some foundational conversation in English. Of course, like anybody, some are easy to work with, others are more difficult. And of course, they're all very concerned that their children get an education. This sounds pretty similar, right? I think everybody in the room can identify with one of these points and say that refugees or asylees are pretty much just like us, and that's because they are. What we found is that about 80% are women and children from across the world. This is no surprise depending on what country they're from and how that plays out. There's about 6.6 million refugees who live in refugee camps across the world. The largest one, which is the Dab, has about 500,000 residents. And about 70% can spend at least 10 years in the camps.
Where is the largest?
That's the Dab, and I can't remember where it is, but I know it's in Africa somewhere. I can't remember where. But yeah, about 70% of them, 70% spend at least 10 years in the camp, which goes to show that this is a pretty complicated process overall. Of about the 195 recognized nations in the world, does anybody want to take a guess at how many actually accept refugees?
33.
Very close. It's 37. Yep. So 37 nations across the world accept refugees. Of course, the United States being one of them. Of the 50 states in the United States, how many do you think accept refugees?
5.
So there's 5, 10, 0, 50. It's not 50 and it's not 0. So it's actually 49. The only state that doesn't is Wyoming.
That must be
Do you want to
why.
end up in Wyoming?
I was close.
It's a lot of it's actually resources. I don't know the specific answers to why Wyoming doesn't. They might not have the infrastructure in place to be able to provide the immense amount of resources and things that go into it. That would be the best, probably the most politically correct answer that I could say. But I know I don't want to end up in Wyoming, so I can't blame anybody else for not. But they don't get a choice to what state they go to, nor do refugees get a choice into what country they go to. So keep that in mind as well. So of the 37 that accept them, you can go anywhere and you don't get a choice in that. Some common countries of refugee origin, of course, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, Africa with various nations actually, because Africa is a continent, not a country. Burma, Syria, and Afghanistan. Traditional resettlement countries, Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the United States. So the U.S., with the United States, in order to accept refugees, this comes from the President of the United States. So as you can see from the map, we actually started accepting refugees back in 1980, and that's moved all the way through to today. Various political administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have their ability to set the limits, raise them, lower them, dependent on the circumstances. We saw record lows from 2018 through 2021, 22 for a wide variety of reasons, but the record highs have been about 185,000, with record lows being about 13,000. So this does vary across the administration, but essentially what that boils down to is the President of the United States, whoever he or eventually she is, has the ability to decide and work through Congress and go through the various approval processes and all of that that's necessary. From there, that boils down to the state level. So each of those 49 states who accept refugees then work with the federal government. So under the current administration, being Governor Katie Hobbs, she works with the federal administration to decide how many get to come into Arizona and what we can appropriate in terms of resources there. Overall, the United States, can't remember how many we've actually accepted, but it's a lot lower than you would think it would be. But that's not necessarily a bad thing in that number as well. So in 2017, it was reduced from about 110,000 admissions down to about 50,000. In 2018, we started seeing historical lows at 45,000 admissions, with the historical low in 2019 at 30,000. And then from 2020 to about 2021, it was 18,000, and conversely 13,000. I'm sorry, 15,000, not 13. And there were added restrictions, and of course, a lot of those came with, we all know what happened in 2020 with a little thing called COVID. So there were a lot more screenings and additional things that played into why that number had to continue to get lowered. Under President Biden, that number for this current year, I believe, is back up to about 125,000, and we're seeing that climb. With Lutheran Social Services specifically, again, we work in Maricopa County and Phoenix, and then in Pima County and Tucson with this service. We are doubling the number of refugees that LSS alone is accepting in Pima County. Our last fiscal year, so fiscal year 22-23, we saw about 400 refugees coming to Pima County alone, with about 578 across the state. This year, just in Pima County, so just the Tucson area really, we're expected to see over 700. So we're statewide, we'll probably be back up closer to the 800 to 1,000 refugees accepted range. So that is certainly changing. We are one of 4 agencies in Arizona who accepts refugees.
This is Arizona, right? All the numbers? Yeah.
These numbers on the screen are nationwide. Yep. Yeah, so the 110 down to,
I don't think so.
No, not even close.
what's that?
Very low.
They seem very low, yeah. This is, as you can see in the bar chart, the highest end on the far side was about 185,000 back in 1980 when this was first established. And it's varied ever since then. So we've never seen those record highs. The highest is just shy of about 150,000 that we've seen across the nation. Yes?
So those numbers are accepted people that have come in, doesn't include illegal.
Yeah, that's a completely separate, this is just looking at the rate of acceptance for those who legally classify as a refugee based on that definition from earlier.
Yeah.
And again, this is determined by the President of the United States, whoever they are at the time. Some key federal agencies that play into this. So again, this is something that's often talked about in the media and by elected officials, especially those on the federal end, about the process of coming into the country and how vetted these folks are. They're pretty thoroughly vetted. So they go through 3 different main federal agencies, but about 6 altogether. But the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of State really play key roles in the refugee resettlement program, making sure that all of these folks are vetted with the background checks and the different requirements there, and are allowed to come into the United States. So these aren't folks who are out there committing crimes. These aren't folks who are terrorists and causing mayhem in their home country. They're serious people who have families and kids who are seeking a better life due to whatever various circumstances they're facing in their home country. Before being resettled into the United States, refugees must be referred by an agency like the United Nations or the UNHCR in order to even be considered for resettlement. The UNHCR collects detailed biographical and biometric data, which can include iris scans, so your eyes, fingerprints, facial scans, all of these things, blood, the whole 9 yards. Then at that point we have DNA, we can go through and do testing and make sure they're not linked to any crimes or any major issues there. The US government specifically, so again, this is only for the US, so one of the 37 countries, then screens the refugee and solely decides whether to admit them to the United States for resettlement. So the government gets the ability to say, Janice, you get to come in, Glenn, you don't. And that happens. Families aren't necessarily always guaranteed that every member in the family gets to come in. One second, I was at a meeting last week and I had heard about a story at the southern border from asylees where the mom, the dad, and 3 kids showed up at the border. The mom and the 3 kids, and actually the mother-in-law as well, all got granted asylum into the United States and are in Texas, and the dad ended up getting turned away and sent back to Mexico. So that does happen. Yes?
Do you know how many refugees would be accepted from Ukraine?
I don't know the specific number for that, unfortunately. I will try to find that out this week, so I can, when I'm back here next week, I can give an update on that.
Okay, thank you.
So in this vetting process, if you will, 8 different US government agencies are involved, so of course the main 3. They do 5 different background checks. 6 different separate security databases, so our federal government's got a pretty good hold on these, federal security databases and knows the aliases and everything you ever need to know about somebody. So if they're passing these, they're pretty vetted folks, right? And in addition, they do 3 in-person interviews. Now, what's interesting about these interviews is that if you are at interview 1, and you're asked a question on what color the sky is, and you say the sky is blue, and at interview 3, you question, the sky's kind of gray. The government will look at that and go, well, why don't these 2 answers match? And there's a potential possibility that it could get kicked out. And if it's kicked out, then they're kicked out of being able to apply for the refugee status, and they have to stay home, and they can't apply again. So those answers have to align in each one of these 3 interviews, and they're not simple questions like what color the sky is. So with refugee resettlement, of course, as I said, the United States is one of 37 countries in the world who accepts refugees, and as you saw, there's about 117 million who qualify for this status. But does anybody want to take a guess at how many refugees are actually resettled into a third country, percentage-wise?
5%.
Anybody else? So it's actually less than 1%.
So of 117 million who are seeking resettlement, less than 1% actually get permission to enter any of the countries.
Correct. Now that's skewed a little bit, and we won't go into it today, that it's a next week's conversation, is the point here is to a third country. So there's kind of 3 prongs to this approach. The first approach is repatriation, okay? We always want to reunite the person with their home country and solve whatever challenge we've solved. So the folks, Ukraine is a great example, okay? We all know what's gone on there and why they've had to flee. Eventually, when the war ends, the goal is to get them back to Ukraine, right? If that can't happen, they have the ability to move to a neighboring country, which is the second step, or be resettled into a third country, like the United States. That would then become their official home, and they can apply for citizenship and the visas and all the things that come with that. So that number is skewed because of that, because we have 2 prongs that we try to go to before we resettle into a third country. So the rights and responsibilities of refugees: they're allowed to work, they're allowed to get an education, they are allowed access to law enforcement and equal treatment under the law. They're allowed to seek other immigration statuses, so they are allowed to apply for citizenship, they're allowed to apply for work visas and all the various things that come along with that. They can apply for a green card, and they must comply with any vaccination requirements like TB testing, MMR, polio, and at least 1 dose of the COVID vaccine. So once you get allowed, yes?
Isn't there a minimum income required?
There's no.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's not what I heard. but-
Yeah. Nope, not to be able
They
to,
had $25,000 a year, or have a sponsor that could do that.
that might be under the asylee process. I'm not 100% sure on that because those constantly change and there is a difference between asylees and refugees. I would be surprised if that is the case under the asylee process, but they are still allowed to work and go through all of that. So once, for refugees, once you're resettled, again, you don't get to choose what country you go to. You also don't get to choose what state you get to go to. So if you are fortunate enough to be resettled here into the United States and fortunate enough to be resettled here in the great state of Arizona, we are one of 4 agencies who work with refugees, and we coordinate with the Arizona State Refugee Resettlement Program and Department of Economic Security, as well as Health and Human Services as well. So refugees in Arizona, so in fiscal year of 2022, so our, we go off of, in this instance, we go off of the government's fiscal year, which runs from October 1 to September 30th. So in fiscal year 22, there were 4,331 refugees resettled into Arizona, and LSS in fiscal year 2023 did about 650, so that number's actually gone up since I last looked. And again, we're going up this next year alone. So the rights and responsibilities of Lutheran Social Services as an agency who works with them. As you can see on the right, this is all the different things that we do. We have a specific time period to actually get this done within the first 30 to 90 days. And again, we'll learn a lot more about that next week. But it is our responsibility and our job to work to provide housing, furnishings, and food for 7 to 10 days. We work with an airport pickup and welcome them with banners and celebrations from the moment they get off the plane. And we work to apply for food stamps like SNAP, TANF. We work and make medical appointments, register the children in schools and adults. We work to get them jobs and assist with English language classes, etc. So lots of different stuff there. And then of course cultural orientation. That's for both sides of the house. So we get culturally orientated as well as they do as well. And then I talked about employment services. After 5 years being here, refugees can apply for citizenship, and their ceremony is usually held at a courthouse or some form of a federal building, and a big deal is really made out of that.
Question.
Yeah.
Of the 650 refugees, where are they coming from? Do you have an idea in general?
Those top 3, the top countries that I showed earlier, Syria, Democratic Republic of the Congo. We have a lot of Afghan parolees still, so a lot of the Middle East area. And we pretty much talked about this and how we welcome refugees, work through self-sufficiency and make sure that they're sustainable and can manage their lives with little to no interference from us or the government, and then work on integration as well. Ways you can get involved, so this is going to talk a little bit more about co-sponsorship, but in reality I can honestly just say, because we don't have any direct services here in Prescott Valley or in Yavapai County, the greatest ways that you guys can get involved is by helping to provide snack packs for our asylees at the southern border. Just usually in a gallon Ziploc bag with some snacks and things that get handed out with some nourishment opportunities. I don't have a flyer, I'll make sure to email it to you, Janice. We're doing our holiday drive, our annual Christmas drive, where we've got a whole list of items on an angel giving tree. Really for you guys, it's going to be those in-kind drives, and if there's a potential partnership where you can sponsor a family from afar and make sure that they have their items that they need, we would certainly be potentially open to that as long as we can work out the logistics. But things like furniture items and things that you might be getting rid of, an old couch or something like that, we have the ability to get that delivered to our office or potentially even come and pick that up. So there are a lot of different avenues that you guys can help out even from afar. So with that, I know we're running pretty short on time, so I know you all have places to be, but if you have any questions, I'm certainly happy to answer.
You have a lot of people coming over from Mexico and everything, so is that not all South Americans and Mexicans or something? It's a lot of different people? Well, yeah,
Central America for
Central.
one, South America as well. And again, there's a pretty big distinction of illegal immigration and the asylee process. You all heard, I hope you have, at least on the media, you know, the caravans that are happening, right? That
Right.
start in Guatemala or, you know, somewhere down there. That's a lot of what we see with the asylees, is they're coming from Central America, South America, or finding their way to Central or South America and then coming up that way.
So really, the illegal aliens are coming in illegally because it's such a difficult process to go through, and they just want out, right? Very likely.
I can neither confirm nor deny that. Illegal immigration is a vastly different topic and puts you into political hotbeds with that. And we really do have to segment the differences between those under the asylee process, the refugee process, and the illegal
The
process.
ones that are all in all of the stuff.
Anybody who's coming to America, we can hope they're coming here for a better life of some capacity. Again, if you're going through the asylee process or the refugee process, you're pretty thoroughly vetted at one point or another. Illegal immigration may not be the case because we don't know that they're here illegally, so.
Right. Now, the ones that are all in the cage,
In the camp, in the,
they're all trying to come in legally, if I'm understanding right.
correct.
Right? Okay.
Yep, and they're going through this process at some point and they just haven't been transferred beyond that. So, yes, sir.
How does this immigration problem that we have affect you and your work? Because it's like two opposite ends of the spectrum. But you've got one end of the spectrum that's getting a lot of the light, which you're not. Most people in this country don't even realize we've got an immigration refugee, program. All they see is the other side of the fence being crushed, and everybody's sent to all the different cities in this country, giving them problems. So how does that affect you in your program?
Yeah, again, it's kind of a political hotbed that we really always have to be cognizant of and constantly fight misinformation campaigns. It's education, so I greatly appreciate you folks, taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the process, and for those joining next week to take that time out as well, because that's what it really does take is a group of us to go out and share with our neighbors, our friends, and our network that hey, big surprise, what we learn on the media is not always 100% accurate, right? And certainly our elected officials, and I'll admit I'm a former elected official myself, don't always say the truth, especially in the partisan side of the house. So it's a little bit of a different case, but it really is fighting the misinformation campaign and ensuring that folks know about the work that we're doing and defining the differences between legal and illegal immigration or asylums or refugee statuses.
Two things, because of the work I do with our synod and Rocky Mountain Synod, I was at Rocky Mountain Synod Assembly this spring, and we were in El Paso to do a border immersion and learn more about this. And there's two things that continue to bounce through my head that I came away with. One is the 117 million people around the world are simply seeking a safe place. They're fleeing their countries because it's not safe for them to be there. They're not coming just because, oh, this is a great place to be where they'll get a better life. They're fleeing for their lives. The other statement that was made is the problem at the border is not at the border. The problem at the border is inland, with our policies, with people's attitudes, with our international policies. And you know, part of what's going on in the rest of the world with civil wars and some wars that we've been a part of supporting are causing people to flee for safety. And it's keeping those things in mind as we're learning more about what's going on at the border and taking the media with a big grain of salt. And I have to run it to work.
No worries, I know you all have another thing, so, yes, thank you all.